They say the true law of the West wasn't written in Washington, but in the ledgers of men who turned debt into chains. Mrs. Calloway, now that your husband is gone, I'm afraid these debts fall to you. The bank will be taking possession of your land tomorrow morning. What they didn't expect was the stranger watching from the shadows, a man who recognized an old trick used against his own people for generations. I believe the lady's account has been miscalculated. In 1881, Texas, some called him a thief, others called him a troublemaker. But to those fighting to keep what was rightfully theirs, they called him something else entirely. Stay until the very end to discover the shocking truth behind this forgotten piece of American history, a story so dangerous to the powerful that they tried to bury it for over a century. Because sometimes justice wears an unexpected face. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, I need you to do something important right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Why? Because here at The Black Rancher, we're uncovering the hidden stories of black heroes who shaped the American West, stories deliberately erased from our history books. If you believe everyone deserves to see themselves in America's great narrative, share this video now. These forgotten tales of courage, dignity, and justice need to be told. Subscribe now, and let's preserve this legacy together. Now let's journey back to 1881 Texas, where our story begins. Cottonwood Springs, Texas, June 1881. The air inside First Territorial Bank hung heavy with cigar smoke and the scent of polished mahogany. Sarah Calloway clutched her handkerchief tightly, knuckles white against the delicate fabric, as she sat across from Thaddeus Morley, the bank president whose belly strained against his gold watch chain. "As I've explained, Mrs. Calloway," Morley said, his tone carrying the practiced patience of a man addressing a child, "your husband's signature appears on these loan documents. With his passing, the full amount, plus interest, comes due immediately." Sarah straightened her back, refusing to shrink beneath his gaze. At 32, with copper hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes hardened by 3 years of managing the small cattle ranch alone, she was no stranger to difficult conversations. "That's impossible, Mr. Morley," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "Robert would never have taken such a loan without telling me. We owned that land free and clear. It was his father's before him." Morley smiled thinly, sliding a document across the polished desk. "His signature suggests otherwise, Mrs. Calloway. $5,000 borrowed last spring." He tapped a finger against the paper. "Due in full, with 15% interest." Sarah stared at the signature. It resembled Robert's hand, but something felt wrong. Her late husband had been meticulous about their finances, especially after his health began failing. She had managed their books for years. There had never been any loan. "This can't be right," she whispered, more to herself than to Morley. "The bank is being more than generous," Morley continued, leaning back in his chair. "Most institutions would have seized the property immediately. I've given you 3 months since your husband's passing, out of respect." The last words dripped with insincerity. Through the bank's front window, Sarah could see the main street of Cottonwood Springs. The town had grown considerably in the past few years. The railroad's arrival had brought new business, new money, and new appetites for land. Her ranch, with its reliable water source and proximity to town, had suddenly become valuable in ways Robert could never have imagined. "I need time," she said, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. "The herd is nearly ready for market. By autumn—" "I'm afraid time has run out, Mrs. Calloway," Morley interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. "The bank will take possession tomorrow morning. I suggest you use today to gather your personal belongings." Sarah felt the world narrowing around her. The ranch was everything: her home, her livelihood, her future. Without it, she had nothing. "There must be something," she began. "There isn't," Morley cut her off, standing to signal the meeting's end. "Unless you can produce $5,750 by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, that land belongs to the bank." As Sarah rose on unsteady legs, the bank's door swung open. The sudden brightness from outside momentarily silhouetted the tall figure entering. Conversations hushed as heads turned toward the newcomer. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite the stares. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, dark trousers tucked into polished boots, a faded blue shirt under a leather vest. The well-worn Stetson shadowed features that bore the evidence of years under harsh sun, but it was the color of his skin that caused the bank to fall silent. Black men weren't uncommon in Cottonwood Springs since the war, but they rarely entered establishments like First Territorial on business of their own. "I believe I'm next," the stranger said, his deep voice carrying a hint of Eastern education that surprised Sarah even more than his appearance. Morley's expression soured. "Wait outside. I have important matters to discuss with my associates." The stranger didn't move. Instead, his eyes, intelligent and observant, moved from Morley to Sarah, noting her reddened eyes and the document still clutched in her trembling hand. "I'm here about a land purchase," the man continued evenly. "I understand that's your specialty, Mr. Morley." There was something in his tone, a subtle challenge, that made Sarah take a second look at the stranger. "Whatever business you think you have here," Morley began, his face flushing, "is legitimate and funded," the man finished, reaching into his vest to produce a leather wallet. "Isaiah Freeman. I've recently sold my interests in Colorado and am looking to establish new operations in this region." Sarah felt a strange flutter of hope as she watched Morley's expression shift from dismissal to calculation. The banker's greed was evidently battling his prejudice, and greed appeared to be winning. "Perhaps," Morley said slowly, "you should come back tomorrow. We may have a prime piece of property coming into our portfolio that might interest a man of business." Freeman's gaze shifted to Sarah again, lingering on the document in her hand. "I'm sure you would," he said quietly, "but I find I prefer dealing directly with property owners. Less complication." As Sarah moved toward the door, Freeman stepped aside, tipping his hat with a courtesy rarely afforded to women in her situation. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment Sarah felt something pass between them, an unspoken understanding. Outside, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly. Sarah paused on the bank steps, dizzy with desperation. Tomorrow morning, everything would be gone. "Mrs. Calloway." She turned to find Freeman standing behind her, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation," he said, keeping his voice low. "Perhaps we might discuss it further." "I have a proposition that could benefit us both." Sarah hesitated. In normal circumstances, she would never consider private conversation with a stranger, let alone one who stood out so distinctly in a town like Cottonwood Springs. But these were not normal circumstances. "I have nothing left to lose, Mr. Freeman," she said simply. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, revealing a glimpse of something dangerous and determined. "That," he replied, "is where you're wrong." The Cottonwood Springs Cafe sat at the edge of town, far enough from the bank that Sarah felt she could breathe again. Unlike the other establishments on Main Street, Widow Parker's Cafe served anyone with money to pay, a policy that had earned her both criticism and a diverse clientele. Isaiah Freeman chose a table in the corner, positioning himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door, a habit Sarah recognized from men who had learned vigilance the hard way. "Coffee, Mr. Freeman?" Widow Parker asked, approaching their table with a pot in hand. "Please," he nodded, waiting until Sarah's cup was filled before continuing. "And perhaps some privacy, Mrs. Parker." The older woman gave a knowing smile. "Of course. Just wave when you need me." She retreated, shooting a curious glance at Sarah that promised questions later. Freeman waited until they were alone before speaking. "Your husband's been gone 3 months." "Yes," Sarah replied, surprised. "How did you—" "Small towns talk," he said simply, "and bankers like Morley rarely wait longer than that to move against a widow's property." Something flashed in his eyes, a controlled anger that suggested personal knowledge of such tactics. Sarah set down her cup. "Mr. Freeman, I appreciate any sympathy, but I don't see how—" "It's not sympathy I'm offering, Mrs. Calloway," he interrupted gently. "It's partnership." From his vest pocket, He removed a folded piece of paper and laid it on the table between them. Sarah recognized it immediately, a land survey map of the region. "Your ranch," he continued, pointing to a clearly marked section, "sits at the junction of Cottonwood Creek and the new railroad spur line. That makes it valuable far beyond its worth as grazing land." Sarah frowned. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Freeman. It's precisely why Morley wants it." "Not just Morley," Freeman corrected. "There's talk of a cattle syndicate forming, Eastern money backing local operations. They need a central holding property with water rights and rail access." Sarah's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "They're planning to control the entire region's shipping." Freeman nodded, impressed. "Exactly. Any independent rancher would have to pay whatever fees they demand to get cattle to market." "So Morley isn't acting alone," Sarah said, the pieces falling into place. "He's their front man." "Banks usually are," Freeman agreed. "They provide the respectability that naked greed lacks." Sarah studied the map, then looked up at the man across from her. His face revealed little, but his eyes held steady on hers. There was something reassuring in that steadiness, a quality she had rarely encountered since Robert's death. "What's your interest in this, Mr. Freeman?" she asked directly. "Why involve yourself in my troubles?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Let's say I have experience with men who build empires by taking what others have worked for." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I owned a successful freight business in Denver. When the railroad wanted my contracts and warehouses, they suddenly discovered irregularities in my loans. The bank foreclosed within a week." "Yet you mentioned selling your interests," Sarah observed. "What was left of them?" he acknowledged. "I fought long enough to negotiate a sale rather than surrender completely, which brings me to my proposition." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I have capital to invest, enough to clear your supposed debt with the bank. In return, I want a partnership in your ranch operations." Sarah's breath caught. "You want to buy into my ranch?" "I want to preserve your ownership while expanding the operation," he clarified. "You know cattle in this land." "I know business and how to recognize a rigged game before the cards are dealt." Hope, dangerous and fragile, flickered to life in Sarah's chest, but practicality tempered it immediately. "Cottonwood Springs won't accept a partnership between a white widow and a black rancher," she said bluntly. "They barely tolerate me running the ranch alone." Freeman's expression didn't change. "I'm well aware of the town's likely reaction, Mrs. Calloway. That's why we wouldn't announce it as a partnership." "Then what?" she asked, confused. "On paper, I would be purchasing your ranch outright," he explained. "The town would believe you're leaving, returning to family back east, perhaps. In reality, you'd remain as the operations manager, with your ownership converted to a private contract between us." Sarah considered this, turning the implications over in her mind. "You'd be taking a considerable risk, Mr. Freeman. If our arrangement was discovered—" "Risk is relative, Mrs. Calloway," he replied evenly. "I've found that people see what they expect to see. They expect you to fail and me to know my place. Their certainty creates our opportunity." Sarah studied him, trying to discern his true motives. "Why would you do this? There must be less complicated investments available." Freeman was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "My father was born a slave in Kentucky," he finally said. "He died a free man, but never owned anything that couldn't be carried away in the night. He taught me that true freedom requires land of your own." His eyes met hers directly. "When I see someone fighting to hold on to what's rightfully theirs, I recognize the battle." The cafe door swung open, admitting a group of ranch hands. Their boisterous conversation faltered as they noticed Freeman. Sarah was painfully aware of the stares directed their way. "We should conclude our business," Freeman said quietly. Sarah nodded, making her decision. "If we do this, I need your word on two things." "Name them." "First, my foreman and ranch hands keep their jobs. They've been loyal through hard times." Freeman nodded. "Agreed." "Second," she continued, "when we've built the operation to sufficient strength, we renegotiate to return majority ownership to me. I want my ranch back, Mr. Freeman, not just the appearance of running it." A genuine smile spread across his face. "Mrs. Calloway, nothing would please me more than to help you reclaim what's yours. He extended his hand across the table. "Do we have an agreement?" Sarah hesitated only briefly before taking his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused from work despite his business success. "We do, Mr. Freeman," she said. "Now, how exactly do you plan to handle Morley and his fraudulent loan?" Freeman's smile turned dangerous. "That, Mrs. Calloway, is where things get interesting. If you're enjoying this journey so far, don't forget that you're watching The Black Rancher, where we uncover the hidden stories of courage and determination that shaped the American West. Hit that like button right now if you want to see what happens when Isaiah Freeman confronts the banker. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We have new stories every week that history tried to erase. Now let's continue our story and see how our hero plans to turn the tables on those who thought they could steal a widow's legacy. Dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs with the promise of another scorching summer day. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her father's pocket watch open before her, counting the minutes until 9 o'clock, the hour Morley had set for her eviction. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her to the window. 3 riders approached the ranch house, Isaiah Freeman at the center, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. All wore formal attire unusual for the dusty Texas plains. Sarah stepped onto the porch as they dismounted. Freeman tipped his hat in greeting, his expression confident but guarded. "Mrs. Calloway," he said formally, aware they might be observed, "may I introduce Mr. Daniel Haywood, attorney from Austin." He gestured to a slender white man with spectacles and a leather portfolio. "And Mr. James Washington, my personal secretary." The second man, also black but lighter-skinned than Freeman, nodded respectfully. His clothing and bearing suggested education and city life rather than the frontier. "Gentlemen," Sarah acknowledged, noting how the formal introductions established a specific impression for anyone watching. "Please come inside." Once within the ranch house, Freeman's demeanor relaxed slightly. "Everything is prepared," he said, checking his pocket watch. "Mr. Haywood has reviewed all necessary documentation." The attorney cleared his throat. "Indeed, I've examined both the alleged loan agreement and the original deed to your property, Mrs. Calloway. There are irregularities that work in our favor." "What kind of irregularities?" Sarah asked. Haywood opened his portfolio, extracting several documents. "The loan document Mr. Morley presented bears your husband's signature dated last spring. However, according to county records, your husband transferred full ownership of this property to you 2 years ago, when his health began failing." Sarah's eyes widened. "He did. Robert never told me. A common practice among ranchers concerned about their mortality," Haywood explained. "He likely wanted to ensure the property couldn't be contested by distant relatives or creditors after his passing." "Which means," Freeman continued, "that any loan using this land as collateral would have required your signature, not his." Hope surged through Sarah. "So the loan is invalid?" "Potentially," Haywood cautioned. "However, banking institutions have considerable influence with local judges. Legal challenges could take months or years, during which time the bank would maintain possession." "Then what's our strategy?" Sarah asked, looking between the men. Freeman smiled. "We don't fight the loan. We pay it." From an interior pocket, Washington produced a leather banking folio. $6,000 in certified bank drafts from the Second National Bank of Denver, he explained. "More than enough to cover the alleged debt and interest." "But there's a condition," Freeman added. "We don't simply hand over the money. We're going to make a spectacle that Morley can't ignore or manipulate afterward." Sarah understood immediately. "Public pressure." "Exactly," Freeman agreed. "Morley relies on conducting his business behind closed doors. We're going to throw those doors wide open." The grandfather clock in Sarah's sitting room chimed 8 bells. They had 1 hour before Morley's deadline. "Mr. Washington will remain here," Freeman explained, "to witness and document everything. Meanwhile, Mrs. Calloway, you and I have an appointment at the bank." By 8:45, Main Street buzzed with unusual activity. Word had somehow spread that something momentous would occur at First Territorial Bank. Shopkeepers lingered in doorways, while ranch hands and townspeople gathered in small clusters, speculating. Sarah and Freeman, accompanied by Hayward, made their way down the boardwalk toward the bank. They presented a striking trio, Sarah in her best dress, Freeman in an immaculate black suit that emphasized his considerable height and dignity, and Hayward with the unmistakable bearing of legal authority. Whispers followed their progress. Sarah heard fragments, widow's ranch and colored businessman chief among them, but kept her eyes forward, chin raised. For the first time since Robert's death, she felt something beyond grief and fear. She felt powerful. Thaddeus Morley stood on the bank steps, flanked by Sheriff Davis, and two men Sarah recognized as representatives of the cattle syndicate Freeman had mentioned. Morley's smug expression faltered momentarily as he registered Freeman's presence alongside her. "Mrs. Calloway," Morley called out as they approached, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd. "I see you've come to surrender your property deed as agreed. A wise decision." "Actually, Mr. Morley," Sarah replied equally loudly, "I've come to settle my husband's alleged debt in full." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. This was unexpected drama, better than any traveling show. Morley's face reddened. "This is a private banking matter." "On the contrary," Hayward interjected smoothly, "repayment of a legitimate debt is a simple business transaction. Surely First Territorial Bank conducts its affairs openly and honestly." The challenge hung in the air. Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably, conscious of the growing crowd. "Perhaps we should continue this inside," Morley suggested, his voice strained. "I think not," Freeman spoke for the first time, his deep voice carrying effortlessly. "Mrs. Calloway has been accused of failing to honor her obligations. It seems only fair that her fulfillment of those obligations be witnessed by the good people of Cottonwood Springs." More townspeople were arriving now, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Sarah spotted Widow Parker and several of her ranch hands, their presence bolstering her resolve. Morley's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't know what game you're playing, Freeman, but this woman owes the bank $5,750, due by 9 o'clock this morning." "A debt based on a loan agreement signed by Robert Calloway last spring," Freeman stated. "Is that correct?" "It is," Morley confirmed stiffly. Freeman nodded to Hayward, who produced a document from his portfolio. "This is a copy of the property deed for the Calloway Ranch," the attorney announced, holding it up for all to see. "Filed with the county registrar 2 years ago, it shows that Robert Calloway transferred full ownership to Sarah Calloway well before the date of your loan agreement." The crowd's murmuring intensified. Sheriff Davis took a step closer, now genuinely interested. "What's your point, Counselor?" Morley demanded, though his confidence was visibly wavering. "My point," Hayward continued precisely, "is that any legitimate loan using the ranch as collateral would have required Mrs. Calloway's signature, not her husband's. The document you hold appears to be, at best, a misunderstanding. Or at worst," Freeman added quietly, "fraud." The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. Morley's face went from red to white. "That's a serious accusation," Sheriff Davis remarked, stepping forward, "one that could be examined in detail if necessary." One of the cattle syndicate representatives touched Morley's arm, whispering urgently. The banker seemed to deflate slightly before gathering himself. "Regardless of who signed," Morley countered, "the debt exists and must be paid today." "And so it shall be," Freeman replied. From his coat, he produced the bank drafts Washington had prepared. $6,000 in certified funds from Second National Bank of Denver, more than sufficient to clear the debt in question. He handed the drafts to Hayward, who presented them to Morley with formal precision. "You'll find everything in order, Mr. Morley." The banker examined the drafts with trembling hands, searching desperately for any flaw. Finding none, he looked up with undisguised hatred. "The debt is satisfied," he acknowledged through clenched teeth. "Excellent," Freeman smiled. "And now the matter of the property deed that you were so eager to claim this morning. I believe Mrs. Calloway should receive documentation confirming her continued ownership, free and clear of all encumbrances." Morley hesitated, looking to the syndicate men for guidance. One gave a barely perceptible nod. "That will take time to prepare," Morley hedged. "Fortunately," Hayward interjected, "I've taken the liberty of drafting the appropriate documentation." He produced another paper from his seemingly bottomless portfolio. It simply requires your signature as bank president, acknowledging receipt of full payment and relinquishing any claim to the Callaway property. The crowd had grown considerably now, with nearly half the town watching the drama unfold. Sarah noticed several prominent businessmen among them, their expressions calculating as they witnessed Morley's humiliation. With no graceful escape, Morley snatched the document, scrawled his signature and thrust it back at Hayward. "Consider our business concluded, Mrs. Callaway," he spat. "First, Territorial will no longer be servicing your accounts." Sarah stepped forward, meeting his gaze directly. "That's quite all right, Mr. Morley. I believe Second National Bank of Denver is opening a branch in Cottonwood Springs next month. I'll transfer my business there." This revelation, news to most of the crowd, caused another wave of whispers. The banking monopoly that had allowed Morley's predatory practices was ending. As Morley retreated into the bank, followed by his associates, Sheriff Davis lingered. "Impressive display, Mrs. Callaway," he said quietly. "Though you might have made a powerful enemy today." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I've also made a powerful friend." She glanced at Freeman, who was accepting congratulations from Hayward. The sheriff followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That remains to be seen. This town has ways of dealing with those who don't understand their proper place." "Then perhaps," Freeman remarked, joining their conversation, "it's time this town learned some new ways." Davis studied him for a long moment. "Be careful, Freeman. Frontier justice can be unpredictable. So can justice of the more formal variety," Freeman replied evenly. "My attorney has copies of everything that transpired here. Any unfortunate accidents would receive thorough investigation from authorities beyond Cottonwood Springs." The warning was clear. Davis nodded slowly before walking away. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah turned to Freeman. "That was remarkable," she said softly. "But what happens now? Morley and his associates won't simply accept defeat." Freeman offered his arm, which she took after only a moment's hesitation. "Now, Mrs. Callaway, we return to your ranch and implement the second phase of our plan." "Which is?" His eyes gleamed with strategic intelligence. "Making your property so essential to the region's prosperity that attacking it would be akin to attacking Cottonwood Springs itself." As they walked back toward their horses, Sarah felt the weight of stares, some curious, some hostile, some simply confused by the scene they had witnessed. But for the first time in months, she walked with her head high. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. Over the following weeks, Cottonwood Springs witnessed a transformation unlike anything in the town's brief history. The Callaway Ranch, previously a modest cattle operation, became the center of frantic activity. Freight wagons arrived daily, bringing supplies, equipment, and workers. The old barn was expanded, new corrals constructed, and the creek dammed to create a reliable water reserve. Most puzzling to the curious townspeople was the large structure being erected near the railroad spur, too substantial for a simple loading pen, yet its purpose remained unclear. Sarah and Freeman had enacted their plan with precise coordination. To the town, it appeared that Freeman had indeed purchased the ranch, with Sarah staying on temporarily to oversee the transition. Their private agreement, witnessed by Hayward and secured in the attorney's Austin office, told the true story, a partnership with a path to Sarah's eventual full ownership. On a sweltering August afternoon, Sarah stood beside Freeman on the porch of her ranch house, watching as workers raised the frame for the mysterious building. "The stockyards in Chicago have similar facilities," Freeman explained, responding to her unasked question. "A combination holding pen, auction house, and processing facility. When it's complete, any rancher in the region can bring cattle here for sale, storage, or shipping." Sarah grasped the implications immediately. "We'll be offering the services the syndicate planned to monopolize." "At fair rates," Freeman confirmed with satisfaction. "And with your foreman Martinez managing operations, the facility will have the respect of local ranchers." Sarah nodded, impressed by his foresight. Luis Martinez had worked for her husband for 15 years and was widely respected among the region's cattle operations. "There's something else you should see," Freeman continued, gesturing toward the smaller building that had been constructed near the main house. Inside, Sarah found a fully equipped office with a large desk, filing cabinets, and most surprisingly, a telegraph machine being installed by a young operator. Direct communication with markets in Chicago, Kansas City, and Denver, Freeman explained. We'll know cattle prices before anyone else in the region. This must have cost a fortune, Sarah remarked, running her hand along the polished desk. An investment, Freeman corrected. Information is as valuable as land in today's market. Sarah turned to him, her expression serious. You've done so much, Mr. Freeman. I'm beginning to wonder if I'll ever be able to repay my portion of these expenditures. His expression softened. You're contributing the most valuable asset, Mrs. Calloway, your knowledge and reputation. Besides, he added with a rare smile, the terms of our agreement give us 5 years to establish profitability before any repayment is due. The telegraph operator cleared his throat discreetly. Excuse me, sir, ma'am. Line's connected if you'd like to send a test message. Freeman nodded. Perfect timing. Please send the following to Mr. Washington in Denver. Facilities nearing completion. Advise syndicate representatives arriving next week. Require additional security measures. As the operator began tapping out the message, Sarah gave Freeman a questioning look. Syndicate representatives? She asked, once they were alone again. Morley's backers, Freeman confirmed. They've requested a meeting. Sarah felt a chill despite the summer heat. They're still planning to take the ranch. They're businessmen before they're anything else, Freeman replied. They recognize we've established a strong position. Now they'll attempt to buy what they couldn't steal. And if we refuse? Freeman's expression turned grim. Then we'll face more direct methods, which is why I've arranged for additional security. Before Sarah could question him further, hoofbeats announced a rider approaching at speed. Luis Martinez pulled his horse to a stop near the porch, his expression troubled. Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Freeman, he called, dismounting quickly. There's trouble in town. Sheriff Davis is gathering men. Freeman stepped forward. What's happened? It's the bank, Martinez explained, removing his hat. Someone broke in last night. The safe was opened. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Was anything taken? Martinez nodded grimly. According to Morley, only one thing, the loan document with your husband's signature. Freeman and Sarah exchanged knowing looks. The only evidence of Morley's attempted fraud was now conveniently missing. Morley's blaming you, Mr. Freeman, Martinez continued. Says you orchestrated the theft to protect Mrs. Calloway from future claims. Freeman's expression remained calm, though Sarah detected a tightening around his eyes. A convenient accusation. I was here all night, as were you and the entire work crew. Truth won't matter if Davis decides to make an example, Martinez warned. There's talk of forming a posse. Freeman turned to Sarah. It appears our visitors have decided to arrive early and set the stage for their negotiations. What do we do? Sarah asked, struggling to maintain her composure. Freeman's reply was interrupted by the telegraph operator calling from the office doorway. Message from Denver, sir, he announced, holding out a slip of paper. Freeman read it quickly, his expression clearing. It seems Mr. Washington anticipated our needs. He handed the telegram to Sarah. The message was brief. Security detail arrived Cottonwood yesterday. 20 men, Buffalo soldiers. Captain Jefferson commanding. Buffalo soldiers? Sarah asked, hope rising in her chest. She had heard of the black cavalry units, their reputation for discipline and courage preceding them. Former members, Freeman clarified, now employed by a private security firm in Denver, owned by a former colonel from the 10th Cavalry. They're entirely legal, properly licensed, and exceptionally well-trained. Martinez whistled low. That changes the equation considerably. Indeed it does, Freeman agreed. Mr. Martinez, please ride back to town immediately. Find Captain Jefferson at the hotel and inform him of the situation. Tell him to deploy his men to the ranch by nightfall. As Martinez rode off, Sarah turned to Freeman. You knew this would happen? I anticipated something, he acknowledged. Though the theft is a particularly clever touch, it discredits us while removing evidence of Morley's fraud. Sarah paced the porch, thinking rapidly. We need to counter this move before Davis arrives with his posse. Freeman nodded. The telegraph gives us an advantage. With your permission, I'd like to send messages to the territorial governor, the federal marshal in Austin, and several newspapers. Messages saying what? That a respected rancher and legitimate businessman are facing violent intimidation after preventing a fraudulent seizure of property, Freeman explained, and that any actions taken against us will receive the fullest scrutiny from territorial authorities. Sarah considered this, then nodded. Do it. And send one more, to Hayward in Austin. He should file our partnership agreement with the county immediately. Freeman raised an eyebrow. That will reveal our arrangement. Exactly, Sarah replied, a new determination in her voice. I'm tired of hiding behind conveniences. If we're to build something here that lasts, it should stand in the open. A slow smile spread across Freeman's face. Mrs. Calloway, I believe you've just changed our defensive strategy to an offensive one. As they turned toward the telegraph office, Sarah paused. Mr. Freeman, Isaiah, there's something I need to know. He waited, his expression attentive. If this escalates, if Davis and his men come with violence in mind, are you prepared for what might happen? Freeman's eyes held hers steadily. I was born into a world that didn't believe I had the right to own myself, let alone property or dignity. Everything I've built has been constructed against resistance. He glanced at the bustling activity around the ranch. What we're creating here matters, Sarah. It's worth defending. The use of her first name wasn't lost on her. Something had shifted between them, from business arrangement to true alliance. Then we defend it together, she said simply. Because you're right. What we're building does matter. Not just for us, but for everyone who believes in the promise of this frontier. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they stood side by side, watching as riders appeared in the distance. Not the sheriff's posse, but 20 disciplined men in neat formation, led by a distinguished officer in a cavalry-style uniform. The Buffalo Soldiers had arrived, and with them the next chapter in their struggle for justice was about to begin. As twilight descended over the Calloway Ranch, an uneasy peace held. Captain Jefferson and his men had established a perimeter, their disciplined presence transforming the property into a virtual fortress. Inside the main house, Sarah, Freeman, and Jefferson reviewed their strategy by lamplight. Sheriff Davis won't risk a direct confrontation, Jefferson asserted, his bearing reflecting his years of military service. Not against former U.S. cavalry with proper licensing. He'll attempt to wait us out or force a legal intervention. Which is precisely why our telegrams to the governor and federal marshal were essential, Freeman noted. They've established that we anticipate potential misconduct and have sought protection through proper channels. Sarah studied the map spread before them. What about Morley and the syndicate? Their accusation about the bank robbery was clearly designed to provoke immediate action. Jefferson smiled grimly. My men conducted some discreet inquiries in town. Several witnesses placed 2 strangers near the bank around midnight, men who arrived on yesterday's train and departed this morning. Hired hands, Freeman concluded, professional enough to leave no evidence connecting them to Morley or the syndicate. A commotion outside interrupted their discussion. Sarah moved to the window, peering through the curtain. Riders approaching, she reported. At least a dozen. Captain Jefferson joined her, his experienced eye assessing the approaching group. Sheriff Davis is leading them, but they're not moving like a posse. This appears more official. Freeman straightened his vest. It seems the confrontation we've been anticipating has arrived. Captain, please have your men visible but non-threatening. Of course, Jefferson agreed. Mrs. Calloway, I suggest you present yourself as the property owner from the outset. Establish your authority immediately. Sarah nodded, smoothing her skirt with suddenly trembling hands. Freeman noticed her nervousness and spoke quietly. Remember, we've broken no laws. We stand on solid legal ground. She met his gaze with renewed determination. Then let's go meet our visitors. Sheriff Davis reined in his horse at the edge of the ranch yard, clearly startled by the disciplined line of armed men standing at ease before the main house. Behind him, a collection of townsmen and what appeared to be county officials shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. This is an official visit, Mrs. Calloway, Davis called out as Sarah stepped onto the porch, flanked by Freeman and Captain Jefferson. I have with me Judge Parker from the county seat and representatives of territorial business interests." "You're welcome to approach, Sheriff," Sarah replied, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Though I'm curious why such a visit requires so many armed men." Davis dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving the Buffalo soldiers. "I might ask the same question, ma'am." "The difference," Freeman interjected, "is that Mrs. Calloway's security detail is legally licensed and properly documented. Are all your companions similarly credentialed for law enforcement?" The question hung in the air unanswered. From among the riders, a distinguished older man with judicial bearing urged his horse forward. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm Judge William Parker," he announced. "I've been asked to mediate this situation before it escalates further." Sarah inclined her head respectfully. "You're welcome in my home, Your Honor, though I'm not certain what situation requires mediation." The judge dismounted, handing his reins to a deputy. "Perhaps we might discuss this privately." "By all means," Sarah agreed. "You may bring 2 representatives with you." After brief consultation, Judge Parker approached accompanied by Sheriff Davis and a well-dressed man Sarah recognized as Victor Hammond, a representative of the cattle syndicate who had been present during the confrontation at the bank. Freeman led the small group into the ranch house, where Captain Jefferson had already arranged chairs around the large oak table in the dining room. Once seated, an uncomfortable silence fell until Judge Parker cleared his throat. "Mrs. Calloway, serious allegations have been made concerning your business associate, Mr. Freeman," he began. "The theft from First Territorial Bank is a matter for proper investigation," Freeman interrupted smoothly. "One that would benefit from outside oversight, given Sheriff Davis's close relationship with Mr. Morley." Davis bristled. "Now see here." "Gentlemen," the judge cautioned, "let's maintain decorum." He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Calloway, there's also the matter of your property. It appears there may be confusion regarding its ownership." "There's no confusion whatsoever, Your Honor," Sarah replied confidently. "I am the sole legal owner of this ranch, as recorded in the county registry 2 years ago when my husband transferred the deed to me. Yet Mr. Freeman has been representing himself as having purchased this property," Hammond interjected, speaking for the first time. Freeman smiled thinly. "I never made such a representation, Mr. Hammond. Town gossip may have drawn that conclusion, but no sale documentation exists because no sale occurred." Hammond's eyes narrowed. "Then what exactly is your role here, Freeman? Why invest considerable resources in another person's property?" "Mr. Freeman and I have a formal business partnership," Sarah explained, producing a document from a nearby desk. "Filed this afternoon with the county clerk, it establishes the Calloway-Freeman Cattle and Shipping Company, with myself as majority owner." Judge Parker accepted the document, studying it with a practiced eye. "This appears to be in order," he admitted, passing it to Hammond, who scanned it with obvious disappointment. "A clever arrangement," Hammond remarked, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though one wonders how the good people of Cottonwood Springs will react to such an unusual partnership." "I imagine they'll react with their pocketbooks, Mr. Hammond," Freeman replied evenly. "When our facilities offer fair prices and reliable service, most ranchers will find their principles quite flexible." Sheriff Davis leaned forward. "That doesn't address the bank robbery, Freeman. Morley insists you orchestrated it to eliminate evidence of the Calloway loan." "A loan that Judge Parker now knows was fraudulent," Sarah countered, "given that my husband couldn't have signed any valid loan agreement after transferring ownership to me." The judge raised a hand for silence. "These are serious allegations on both sides. However, without evidence, they remain merely accusations." "Perhaps this might clarify matters," Freeman suggested, producing a telegram from his pocket. "This arrived just before your party did. It's from the federal marshal in Austin, confirming that 2 known confidence men were apprehended on this morning's train to San Antonio. They were carrying a considerable sum and documents stolen from First Territorial Bank." He handed the telegram to Judge Parker, whose eyebrows rose as he read it. "It further states," Freeman continued, "that under questioning, these men implicated a prominent local banker in hiring them to remove evidence of financial impropriety." Davis paled visibly. Hammond's expression hardened to granite. "This is absurd," Hammond declared. "These criminals would say anything to reduce their sentences." "Perhaps," the judge acknowledged. "But it warrants investigation by federal authorities rather than local ones." He fixed Davis with a pointed stare. "Sheriff, I believe this development places the bank robbery investigation beyond your jurisdiction." Davis clenched his jaw, but nodded reluctantly. Hammond rose abruptly. "This changes nothing about the larger situation. Your partnership remains untenable in this community." Sarah stood as well, drawing herself up to her full height. "Mr. Hammond, I believe you're speaking for the cattle syndicate that attempted to use Mr. Morley to seize my property. Since that approach failed, perhaps you should present your actual proposal." Hammond looked momentarily taken aback before regaining his composure. "Very well, Mrs. Calloway. My associates are prepared to offer $30,000 for this property, 5 times its value as a cattle ranch." "An interesting offer," Freeman remarked, "though considerably less than the property's value with the improvements we've made and the shipping facilities nearly complete." "Those facilities are precisely the issue," Hammond snapped. "The syndicate has exclusive arrangements with the railroad. Your operation would interfere with established business interests." "Monopolistic interests," Sarah corrected, "which is why we've also secured our own contracts with the railroad, approved by their Chicago office yesterday." This revelation clearly shocked Hammond, who looked to Judge Parker for support. The judge, however, was studying the partnership agreement with renewed interest. "Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Freeman," he said thoughtfully, "you've clearly established legal standing for your enterprise. While Mr. Hammond's concerns about community acceptance are not entirely without merit, they don't constitute legal grounds for interference." He gathered his papers and stood. "Sheriff Davis, I believe our official business here is concluded. The federal investigation will proceed regarding the bank matter, and Mrs. Calloway's ownership rights are clearly established." "This isn't over," Hammond warned as they moved toward the door. "The syndicate has influence beyond this county." "As do we," Freeman replied calmly, "though we would prefer cooperation to conflict. Your syndicate members would be welcome to use our facilities at the same fair rates we'll offer all ranchers." Hammond didn't respond, his expression making clear that compromise wasn't in his vocabulary. As the judge and his party departed, Sarah and Freeman stood on the porch watching them ride away. Captain Jefferson joined them, relief evident in his bearing. "A successful outcome," he observed, "though I suspect Mr. Hammond is correct that this isn't truly over." "No," Freeman agreed. "But we've secured the legal high ground and publicly exposed their methods. Their next moves will need to be more subtle and likely focused on turning the community against us rather than direct confrontation." Sarah gazed out at the ranch, her ranch, with its new buildings and bustling activity. "Then we'll need to ensure the community sees the benefits of our operation quickly, starting with the autumn cattle drive." Freeman nodded appreciatively. "Using their self-interest to overcome their prejudice. A wise strategy, Mrs. Calloway." "Sarah," she corrected, turning to face him directly. "After all we've been through, I think we've earned first-name terms. Isaiah." His smile warmed his normally guarded features. "Indeed we have, Sarah." Captain Jefferson cleared his throat discreetly. "I'll check the perimeter before turning in. Good night, Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Freeman." As Jefferson walked away, Sarah and Isaiah remained on the porch, the tension of the confrontation gradually ebbing away. "We did it," Sarah said softly, still somewhat amazed at their victory. "The first battle," Isaiah cautioned. "Many more lie ahead." She nodded, understanding the truth of his words. "But we won't face them alone." Isaiah's gaze met hers, holding it with an intensity that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "No," he agreed quietly, "we won't." In that moment, beneath the vast Texas sky studded with emerging stars, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate alliance to save her ranch had become something more, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision. The Calloway Freeman Cattle and Shipping Company would face resistance, prejudice, and likely sabotage in the months ahead. But they had established something powerful, a foundation for a new kind of enterprise on the frontier, one that valued fairness over exploitation and cooperation over dominance. And perhaps, though neither of them had yet acknowledged it openly, they had laid the groundwork for something else as well, a personal connection that transcended business and defied the rigid boundaries of their time. As they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen over their shared achievement, both knew that the true journey was just beginning. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that share button right now and help us spread these powerful forgotten histories that shaped America. These aren't just stories, they're pieces of our collective heritage that deserve to be remembered and honored. I want to thank you for staying with me through this journey of courage, justice, and determination. At The Black Rancher, we're committed to uncovering the erased chapters of history, the black cowboys, entrepreneurs, and pioneers who helped build the West against tremendous odds. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and join our growing community dedicated to preserving these vital stories. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or telling us which part of Isaiah and Sarah's story resonated with you most. Until our trails cross again, this is The Black Rancher, reminding you that true history is always more compelling and more inclusive than the sanitized versions we've been taught. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next ride through our forgotten past.